Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Southwest El Nino and Drought Status webinar. My name is Elizabeth Waite. I'm with NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System. In today's webinar, I'm really pleased to have two great speakers to bring you up-to-date information on the drought in the Southwest and what's happening with El Nino. Our first speaker is Dr. Nancy Sellover. Nancy is a state climatologist for the state of Arizona. She'll provide us with information on the drought in the Southwest states of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah. Our second speaker is Mike Halpert. Mike is the Deputy Director of NOAA's Climate Prediction Center. As you all may recall, Mike presented on El Nino in our November drought webinar. In his presentation today, he'll give us an update on El Nino and how El Nino has or has not affected the drought in the Southwest region. Mike will also present the outlook for drought, temperature, and precipitation in the region. After Nancy and Mike's presentations, we will open the webinar for your questions. During the webinar, you are welcome to type in your questions in the question box on the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar control panel. There's a section for questions. Go ahead and type in your questions, but we will only address those questions at the end of the presentations. Victor Murphy, who is with NOAA's National Weather Service in the Southern region, will facilitate the Q&A. Throughout the webinar, all participants are muted, so you can only type in your questions if you have questions. The webinar will finish in 1 hour. If you have any remaining questions, you're welcome to email me. And at the end of the presentations, my email address will show up on the screen on the final slide. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded. The webinar recording and a brief written report will be available on drought.gov. Before we begin, I want to thank so many organizations and individuals who have put together and support this webinar series, including state climatologists in each of the states in the region, NOAA's National Weather Service and Climate Prediction Center, and many others. Their willingness to take time to share their expertise and guide the content of these webinars is really invaluable to providing you with the most up-to-date information on drought. So thank you. And now I'm going to turn over to Dr. Nancy Sellover. I apologize. Here we go. Thank you, Nancy.
Okay, welcome. I'm going to be talking about where we are, a little bit kind of about where we got here, sort of a little picture since the end of the last water year. So we'll start out with where are we now. We'll be talking both about long-term and short-term. This image is from August 6th of 2018 in the US GS gauge at Chevelin Fork near Winslow. Shortly after this image was taken, the site went completely dry, and that had not happened in over 30 years. There had been no flow at this gauge since April of 2017 until finally January of this year we started having some flow, and currently it's flowing above normal. So take a look at the last 4 months since the start of the water year. Most areas in the Southwest have been wetter than the 81 to 2010 normal, except Northwest New Mexico, Southwest and Northeast Colorado. At the same time, we've generally been cooler than normal, a welcome change from previous years for sure. And there's a few exceptions to that where temperatures have been a little warmer than normal. The Colorado River Basin, we take a look at this. It's made a dramatic shift. On the upper left, you'll see we were at less than 70% of average for the end of the 2018 water year, and we've moved then by the end of October to over 150% of average across pretty much the entire Colorado River Basin. Precipitation slowed a bit after that, but for most of the upper and lower basin, we're still wetter than average. Exceptions are Southwest Colorado and Northwestern New Mexico. During this time, short-term drought improvement has been significant, particularly in the reduction of extreme and exceptional drought in the Four Corners region. Extreme drought or worse dropped from 25% of the Southwest at the beginning of October, the upper left map, to just under 7% in the latest drought monitor map that just came out today. Southern Arizona and much of southeastern New Mexico saw the emergence of no drought in the short term, and in New Mexico that might not last long if they continue to have the current dry pattern that they've been seeing. We go to the last 7 and 30 days maps, they indicate a rather localized precipitation pattern, and the dry conditions you can see certainly in New Mexico are quite significant. Daily stream flow is near normal for much of the region, though the Four Corners area still has some reduced base flows, as do basins in northern Colorado, northern Utah, and northern Arizona. This is largely due to the huge deficits in moisture over the past year or longer. So we'll see what happens in spring when the runoff season starts. And hopefully Mike will talk a little bit about that later. As we move toward the long term, soil moisture in the top 1 meter is quite varied across the region. The Four Corners and much of Colorado and northern Utah has some dry soil, which is going to be coming into play during the spring runoff, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I'm going to take you now on a quick trip through the SPEI from 48 months through the most recent 4 months. We're going to be seeing the longer term effects of the warm, dry conditions the Southwest has experienced. The 48-month map shows the all but eastern Colorado and New Mexico to be extremely dry. The past 3 years was even worse than that, particularly in the Four Corners area. So then I jump up to the last 24 months, and this had the driest conditions in southwest Colorado and the Four Corners region. So we go to the past 12 months. We've seen some improvement, and this is not because the last 12 months were all wet, as we certainly know, but mostly this is a factor of the last 4 months, which look like this. That was quite wet. So this map was a welcome change, certainly from the past 4 years, and it has not alleviated the long-term water supply conditions. However, it has made some short-term improvements, as we saw in the short-term drought monitor maps. So much more is going to be needed in order to improve the long-term situation. So NRCS no longer seems to provide the reservoir maps, the teacups, so I don't have Utah and Colorado's teacups. My impact information is that their reservoirs, Utah and Colorado, are going to be starting the spring runoff season very low. Arizona reservoirs along the Colorado River and the lower Colorado are highly managed, and so they're quite full, providing irrigation water to California. The other reservoirs in Arizona, like Lyman Lake and San Carlos, are very low, as is the Verde River at 35% of capacity. The Salt River system is starting out at about 50% of capacity. Lakes Mead and Powell are both at 40%. It's likely that Mead's going to drop below the 1075 value at the end of the year, but regardless of whether it does, the shortage has been a projection. Powell is in a lot worse condition than a year ago due to the exceptional dryness over this past winter. So these are certainly of concern. New Mexico's largest reservoirs are in much worse condition. Elephant Butte is only at 7% of capacity, so there's some serious issues there. Snow water equivalent map shows most of Utah is above the 81 to 2010 average. Colorado is near to above average in most of their basins. New Mexico and northern Arizona are near to above average. The upper Gila Basin, however, down in southern Arizona and southern New Mexico, is below average. The upper Rio Grande Basin has climbed up to the median this year, which is a major improvement over last year. Hopefully it will stay there. We'll see what happens as we move forward into and we get to the runoff season. So some impacts from around let's see. So in Utah, short-term impacts. So we have snowpack that's near or above average in almost all basins, so that's certainly good news. But long-term, we're going to be needing to see several above-average years of runoff in order to make up for the deficits. The soil is dry underneath the snowpack, so the runoff situation when we get to spring may be low, and so that may be leaving some of the reservoirs low, which are already starting out low at this point in time. Colorado impacts, short-term. Winter wheat is in the ground and germinated, so that's a good thing. Snowpack is near 100% of normal, so that's a good thing. Ski resorts are doing okay with the snowpack. In the southwest, the upper Rio Grande and San Juan basins are doing much better than they did last year, which is nice. And the exposed soils are currently wet because they've been having some precipitation. But the long term, the lower than average spring runoff is forecast due to dry soils that are underneath the snowpack and some drier reservoirs. New Mexico impacts short term. Ski resorts doing okay, where they've got some good snowpack. San Juan County still has some water restrictions, so there's issues there. The Animas stream flow continues to be low up in the northwest, and there's dust from the White Sands area that's being transported all the way into Texas. So that's sort of an issue. They're having some dryness in the southern southeastern part of the state. Elvado Reservoir is the image here. Began the water year near 10% of capacity, so that's an issue. I thought I'd give you a nice picture they sent me. The impacts for the long term, like some of the other states, reservoirs are going to likely remain low as the soils dry beneath the snowpack, and the reservoirs like this one are starting out extremely dry at the beginning of the water year. Arizona's impacts. We have some different impacts in Arizona. The NDVI looks good. We've got a lot of green up at a lot of the lower elevations that we have because we've been seeing quite a bit of precipitation, particularly in southwestern Arizona. The recent rain has brought stream flows up in some parts of northern Arizona and not so much in others. And the rain that we're getting and are going to be getting and have been getting in the southwest part of the state may interfere with harvesting. So while a lot of us are really excited to have precipitation, there's some people that aren't necessarily quite so excited because it may interfere with them being able to get out into the fields to do the harvesting. Long term, the Salton Verde watersheds are between the median and average, which is way better than they were last year, so we're excited about that. The runoff outlook is good at this point in time. We'll see what happens as we continue through the winter. The October rain soaked the soil in Arizona, and it remained wet through the dry November and through dry early December. So underneath our snowpack and our watersheds along the Mogollon Rim, the soils tend to be saturated, so that's one of the reasons our runoff outlook is pretty good. We do have low groundwater levels, and so that's going to take a while to recover because those things don't happen in any single season. And on a good note at the end is the wildfire situation. At this point in time, the current outlook is for a normal wildfire season, which would certainly be good news relative to some of the previous years we've had, certainly more recently with the dry conditions. So that's my update, and I'm going to let you turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Nancy. I will hand over to Mike now. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, I'm going to take a shot that folks can see my screen since I did accept. Very good. Thanks for having me back. Today's timing is interesting in terms of it's the day that we release our updated ENSO diagnostics discussion, which updates the status of El Nino, but it is a week prior to when we update our seasonal outlooks, including the drought outlook. So those products will be a little bit on the old side. Let's see. So I guess our big news today was that after being in an El Nino watch for what seemed like the better part of 2018, we have upgraded to an advisory. So that means that El Nino conditions are present. They are certainly weak, and that's actually typically the case when you first upgrade from a watch to an advisory. You typically at least have to go through the weak stage, but given the timing of this year and the way things look, we're expecting it to stay weak and really not necessarily extend for that much longer. It's roughly 50 to 60% shot that it will last through the spring. Whoops, sorry about that. So, and again, the fact that it is kind of late in the rainy season and weak, we're not really anticipating large impacts on the remainder of the rainy season out west. Just a quick reminder for what we're talking about when we talk about El Nino. So here we're looking at maps of sea surface temperature, departures from average. The top would be, you can see it says colder. That means that the ocean is colder than average there. That's La Nina. The bottom one is from December 1997, one of the stronger El Ninos. The current pattern, which we'll look at in a minute, looks nothing really like that, but that is the sense of El Nino. It's when the ocean becomes warmer than average. So I'm going to go through all these quickly. So the typical cycle, this and the way we like to see these develop is over a roughly 9 to 12 month period, and we oftentimes see these develop as we head into the fall, which is a good time if we want to see impacts on the winter, because that's also typically when it's strongest. And you can see that we often weaken and kind of return to normal during the spring. So here, instead of seeing the typical life cycle, we're seeing one where it's kind of just starting as we're kind of almost headed towards the part when it's weakened. So it is somewhat unusual, although certainly not unprecedented. I actually was looking back at the 2015 period, and that one started in early March, so very close to this timing. Certainly for those that pay attention to El Nino will probably remember that really strengthened throughout 2015 and became one of the strongest one on record. We certainly don't expect that out of this one. There are a few other weaker type events back in time. I think there was one in 94, 95 that had a timing somewhat similar to this, where we really didn't see everything kind of come together until really the later part of winter. So what do we need to declare an El Nino? And this is a slide that we like to show because it kind of, in what we consider, at least as scientists consider in a simple fashion, is there's basically three conditions that we look for before we have El Nino. The simplest one is that the east central tropical Pacific, and we'll look at that in a minute, is at least a ½ degree Celsius above average. So that would be where we're starting up at the top. And that's actually been something that we've seen since going back to last October or November. So that's been in place for a while. Since El Nino is a phenomenon that typically extends for a period of time, the next requirement, and this is a forecast, of course, but that we expect that it will persist over some number of seasons. And then finally, what's been really the problem with this particular event was that we need an atmosphere that we talk about a Walker circulation, not that important in terms of terminology, but basically we want to see something change in the atmosphere that resembles a typical El Nino pattern. And the reason why we look for that is because without changes in the atmosphere, we're not going to see impacts over the United States. And really for those of us in the United States, that's certainly what we care about. And the simplest way we look at is patterns of tropical rainfall. We like to see the rainfall that's typically over Indonesia and the far west Pacific kind of dry up over that area and shift into the central part of the basin. So here we're looking at what the sea surface temperature anomalies or departures have looked like over the last month. That blue box in the middle of the screen is the area that we refer to as Niño 3.4. It's what we base our Oceanic Niño index on. And you can see that it's all in shades of yellow and orange, so it's all above average. You might notice that it's actually warmer, or the departures are bigger to the west and actually to the east. So it turns out that for right now, the coolest part of the Pacific is right in our key region. It is still above our threshold, but it's somewhat marginal. We're actually expecting that to warm up over the next couple of months, but it is marginally warm enough for it to meet the first requirement. We look in terms of will it persist, and so here we're looking at time series from various dynamical computer models for the value averaged in this blue box going forward. So you can see that the black line at the beginning, that's actually the observations. So it was actually warmer going back to October, November, and December than it is in January, but it is still right at the threshold. And we have an interesting situation here where there are a number of models that keep this episode going really through the summer and starting to approach the fall, where we would have to then decide whether we'll see impacts on the back end or next winter. There are some other models, though, that are saying, well, it'll kind of limp along and then kind of crash. And there's this one particular model that says, no, this is as good as it's going to get. Now, we certainly don't expect that to verify, but it is certainly in the model solutions that we're looking at inside that envelope. I talked about the atmosphere, and this is kind of a proxy for tropical rainfall. And so this is really what we had been waiting on, this area that I'm circling. Hopefully you can see it, this blue area that extends just to the east of the international date line, extends back as far as about 140 or 150 degrees east. So this is the area that oftentimes is back over Indonesia and the West Pacific, that has finally moved out into an area where we can see it impacting the jet stream across the Pacific Ocean to the north and then having downstream impacts over the United States. And actually looking at some of the model forecasts for the rest of February, we see this pattern shifting even further into the central part of the basin, kind of putting it into an area that is more favorable for impacts as we go forward over the next at least month, maybe two. So these are the official probabilities on where we expect El Nino to go. When I did this back in November, interestingly enough, the bar graphs, these probabilities were much higher, largely because they're keyed almost exclusively to the departures in that area in the equatorial Pacific, and they were warmer at that time. So you know, I commented that we still see at least a 55% chance that this will be going on through March, April, May. And, you know, after that, we start to favor even neutral conditions. It doesn't certainly mean that this event can't continue. You know, looking at probabilities from 2015, they were much higher at that point. So we were more bullish on that event. And so certainly the most likely thing is that this will tail down as we go through the spring and into the earlier part of the summer. But, you know, there is still some probability that this event will be ongoing as we go through the summer months. So what does it mean, and why do we care that we have El Nino? So, you know, this is what we call it typical. It's basically averaging all of the previous years that had El Nino in the months of MAM, stands for for March, April, May. On the left is what it says composite anomalies, and so this is basically just an average of all of the departures for all those years in terms of millimeters for that 3 month season. So certainly the best signal for this is along the Gulf Coast and maybe in parts of California. You know, a little tilt towards above average precipitation in Arizona and New Mexico. But the figure on the right is quite instructive in that it gives the frequency or the percent of the years that actually saw the sign. So it's for these areas that are wet, like in Arizona and New Mexico. You can see that there's even some blue shading, some of the lighter shades. So we're basically saying that maybe half, maybe even less than half of the years that went into this composite were on the wet side. So you can get that because you know, you throw in a couple of very wet years in there, and when you average everything together, you can still have an outcome that shows wet. It's even more pronounced in parts of California where there's some areas that are in the 20 or 30%, but yet they still show up as wet. And again, you know, a couple of really wet March, April, May years that were associated with El Nino can sway things, and that's why we do pay attention to this frequency composite to get some idea of the reliability of the signal. So there's been a lot of talk, at least we've gotten a lot of questions here that you know, this has been a decent, if not good, rainy season in California and the Southwest, and you know, is it El Nino? And of course our response is generally, well, no, because we haven't had El Nino. We really haven't seen any of those changes into the atmosphere that would have been associated with enhanced precipitation in California and the Southwest. What we have had is a different phenomena, and it's probably too technical maybe for this audience, but it focuses, it's a phenomena that operates on a much higher frequency or much faster than El Nino. In the sense that it can impact weather for a couple of weeks and then kind of get into phases that would dry you out and all. And so I've got a time series here, and I do have another one for Tucson that I'll show in a minute, but the signal was a little clearer here over San Diego, so I wanted to bring that out. And San Diego's had quite a wet year. I mean, they're pushing close to you know, double their normal rainfall. But these circles on the left show times when we would have potentially seen some type of a response that would have extended the jet stream across the Pacific, which is always favorable for atmospheric rivers. And we saw that happen in late November, and then around the new year, and then again recently in early February. And in each of those cases, we certainly had rainy periods into San Diego, and I believe if I go forward, a similar type thing in Tucson, certainly not quite the magnitude, although it's a much drier station. but still, so if I was, had to give an answer as to the rain that we've seen out west this year, certainly one of the candidates would be what we call it's this Madden-Julian oscillation or intraseasonal oscillation. If you look down at the bottom of this slide, though, you'll notice, and this was actually pulled this morning, that this blue area, which again is favorable for what we would look at in terms of rainfall, is maybe becoming a little more pronounced. And instead of traveling around the globe, it's potentially kind of setting itself in. And that's really the hallmark of El Nino. If this had been a year dominated by El Nino, these blues would have just dominated the whole thing. We wouldn't have seen these strong breaks in this pattern. So I'm just showing one or two slides actually from the November one. This was our outlook that I presented back in November for the winter. We were somewhat bullish on at least improvement over parts of at least Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado. Not as bullish over Utah. You saw what Nancy showed, and that the rains have been, probably better than we anticipated. In terms of changes in the drought monitor, this is a 3-month change, so it's from mid-November through actually last week. But certainly, most of the area has green, so that we've seen improvement. Some areas more so than others. California, I think, has some of the largest improvements. So, while not rainfall driven by El Nino, certainly a decent enough rainy season, and maybe more to come. And I'm going to show a few outlooks here. This is actually a product from our sister organization here at NCEP, the Weather Prediction Center. It shows the forecast for the 7-day rainfall. We call it QPF, Qualitative Precipitation Forecast. And so you can see that at least, good chunks of the Southwest are looking at, at least a ½ inch of rain. Some parts of Arizona, pretty significant amounts, 3 inches of rain. In the area where the drought is the worst, still a lot of this is favored to get 1 to 2 inches of rain over the next week. Going forward from there, these are the Climate Prediction Center's 6 to 10 and week 2 outlooks. These are from yesterday. I don't think there were significant changes today. I hadn't seen them when I put this together. But again, we certainly are continuing the tilt towards wetter than average conditions in really all of the Southwest. So this goes pretty much through the end of the month. This is, again, I mentioned an older forecast. It'll be updated next week, but the outlook, and this was prior to El Nino being here, so I honestly cannot say, and so it's no point in asking me whether or not what the outlooks will look like next week, because we haven't started looking at it yet, to be honest. We'll start that process tomorrow. But we did certainly favor, above average precipitation on the expectation that El Nino would develop. Again, these are probabilistic forecasts. I tried to help out here by giving the actual meaning of this. So at this kind of area in northern New Mexico, while we tilt wetter than average, it certainly wouldn't be unheard of for this season with a 1 in 4 chance to be drier than average. Finally, I believe this was the monthly drought outlook. So this is actually the latest drought product that we have, issued on the last day of January. And that was a case where we really finally caught on to the wetness that has really been impacting good chunks of California and the Southwest, largely during February, as well as what's yet to come, where we see good chunks with drought removal and really the core area, certainly improvement, although again, you don't go from extreme or exceptional drought to no drought over the course of one season. So just summarizing in terms of El Nino, we did finally see a weak El Nino develop last month. The pattern of sea surface temperatures is interesting in terms of, while it's all warm, it's actually warmer in the areas outside of our key region. But we do actually expect it to increase over the next couple of months and persist through the spring. And after that, I would say it's probably anybody's guess as to where this event will go. Forecasts during the spring for El Nino are typically our poorest. So I wouldn't suspect we'll have a good idea as to where El Nino goes, later on in this year, probably until we get to May, would be my guess. And just a few helpful links at the bottom, our discussion and our always friendly ENSO blog down at the bottom. And with that, I will turn it back to Elizabeth or Victor if you're moderating.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Mike. This is Victor Murphy. So if anyone has any questions, you can either hit the little question mark icon there, or else raise your hand. Click on that icon, it'll show up next to your name and I'll get to you. Or you can hit the question box at the bottom and type in your question. So while folks are doing that, I did want to get to perhaps Mr. Ken Clark from the city of Boulder. I see where Ken had his hand raised earlier. I'm not sure if he had a question or not, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute Mr. Clark. Still on the call. May have dropped off. Okay, I think he did drop off. So anyway, if anyone has any questions, like I said, just raise your hand there on the bar there next to your name, or else you can click on the question mark icon. Okay, I see there's a question here. Bear with me. Grace Hood. Grace, I'm going to unmute you so you can go ahead and ask your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Great. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more from somebody. I saw the Colorado slide that mentioned a lack of soil moisture for parts of Colorado. I'm just interested in hearing a little bit more about the interaction between that lack of soil moisture and reduced spring runoff, particularly as it relates to southwest Colorado and that Four Corners region, which was just so stricken by drought.
Becky, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I can take it. Hi, Grace. It's Becky Bollinger. So the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center is a great resource for this, and they're putting out their water supply forecast for the Upper Colorado River Basin. And their forecasts for water supply are actually showing lower than average throughout the area, despite decent snowpack, and a lot of it is being driven by the very low soil moisture percentiles that they saw at the very beginning of the cold season. So the idea being that as soon as the snow starts melting, the first bucket that it's going to want to fill is that soil moisture into the ground. And what that will mean is that the snow that we think is available that's going to go to runoff, part of that is actually going to go into the ground first, and so the stream flows might not bump up as high as we would expect if the soil moistures were at a regular level, and that will mean there will be less in the rivers and then less going to the reservoirs. So they're generally forecasting for a little bit less, and it is primarily due to that soil moisture being very, very dry at the beginning.
How significant of an issue do you think that's?
It's so hard to tell. We don't have as good of a handle on soil moisture as we do on snowpack. Snowpack we really know well, and soil moisture, it's more of it's modeled rather than observed. So sometimes it's a little bit harder to say for certain, but I think there's pretty good confidence that that's going to be a critical piece in the spring, and there might be some uncertainty as to how critical. And the other uncertainty there is also going to be how much will we lose to the atmosphere from sublimation of the snow, especially as we get into March and we get more dust on snow events. We could lose some of the snow to the atmosphere too. So we do have a couple of uncertainties there. It's a good reminder that snowpack is not a guarantee of what your available water supply will be. You haven't put that money in the bank yet. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi Becky, this is Victor. That's a real good answer, and I'll take this opportunity to mention to all the attendees that our next webinar, which I think will probably be in late March or perhaps in April, we will focus on the runoff forecast. We'll have the River Forecast Center on that Becky alluded to, and so they can maybe go over, with us in some detail or some greater detail exactly what they're looking at with regard to the runoff. Elizabeth, if you don't mind putting the I think it was one of Nancy's slides on. It was one which showed the snow water equivalent, I believe, for the four corner region. And I think it showed the one was Utah was well above normal. And but anyhow,
can you see is it on the screen now? Nancy's slide deck.
I don't see it.
No?
Yeah, I'm looking at the drought resources URLs.
Huh.
If you can take back control, maybe
Yeah.
go up to. But anyway, for everyone's sake, I think as the as that slide showed, and as Becky pointed out, the snow water equivalent right now, the snowpack's looking pretty good. But nonetheless, temperatures have been below normal by and large. Forecast to stay below normal, I believe, next week or two. So as of right now, it's just all sort of checks in the mail, and we'll have to see. Once we do get some, once the snow melt starts to begin, as Becky pointed out, March or April, we'll see how things shake out. Yeah, I think that's it right there. Thank you. Yeah, so there's a snow water equivalent. You can see really by and large the area is looking pretty good. Everyone's got at least near normal snowpack. A few areas are above normal, but there's still a lot of time left before we get the snow melt and the runoff. And as Becky pointed out, if you get real warm and dry, say March or April, you lose a lot of that snowpack to snow water equivalent, perhaps a sublimation, or just runs off and goes in the soil moisture. The runoff may not be all that great. So anyway, so let me check and see if there's any other questions at all. I don't see anything right now. Grace, does that answer your question? You're still live on the mic there. Does that answer your question okay?
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, going down here. I don't see any more questions, Elizabeth. So want to just perhaps wrap it up to the group, or if Mike or Nancy have any reattacks.
This is Nancy. The next couple days, the particular storm that's coming through for Arizona today is actually fairly warm. Early next week, the next one that comes through is supposed to be colder. So we may lose some of our snowpack because the snow levels are going to be kind of high for this first round. But then the next one will be lower. So we may lose some and then gain some more next time. But for us, that kind of helps send some of that snow that's currently snow back into the groundwater system. So by the time we really get to spring, we should really have saturated soils. I don't know if that's going to be the case for New Mexico, Colorado, or Utah.
Yeah, definitely not further north. You're pretty much stocked in until, even with warm anomalies, probably till more into March.
Well, then we'll just have to hope that we don't have a really early melt out this year.
Yes.
I would say, just looking at our 6 to 10 in week 2 outlooks, looks like we've got quite a bit of cold settling into really the whole western part of the nation. So certainly that will cover at least through the end of February.
Yeah, so short-term things are definitely looking up, and as I mentioned earlier, I think our next webinar we're going to emphasize the runoff and the forecast stream flows. We'll have it sometime in late March or early April. And Becky, Elizabeth, do we have any more information we can share with the attendees with regard to the next webinar?
I will definitely send out invitations to everyone who's joined the webinar, and that will include the date and time of the presentation by the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, and probably another presenter too on also focused on water supply reservoir levels. So thanks for mentioning that, Victor. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I think for right now we're very we're cautiously optimistic that things will be looking pretty good. Although there's still a lot of daylight between now and when the runoff starts in earnest. But as Mike mentioned, with the next couple of weeks remaining below normal, more likely than not remaining below normal temperature-wise, and forecast still looking a little bit on the wet side, I think it's definitely cause for optimism. And I don't see any other questions, Elizabeth, so if you don't mind, Lisa Jensen, thank you for your nice comments. So Elizabeth, without seeing any other questions, I will pass it off back to you.
Okay, thanks, Victor. Thank you very much, Nancy and Mike, for presenting today. We really appreciate it. Your expertise and your knowledge is really, really phenomenal. Thanks for sharing with us. And everyone, thanks for joining, and happy Valentine's Day.